As people start to log on, we'll go ahead and get started with our introductions because we have a lot of content to cover today. So my name is Claire Blameyer, and I'm a project manager with Stanford's Palliative Care Health Education Program. Our mission is to increase awareness of palliative care in the community. We are partnering with SUCM to provide quarterly educational events for the South Asian community. Many people have never heard of palliative care or have misconceptions about it, but we're an interdisciplinary team of doctors, nurses, spiritual care providers, and social workers who provide holistic care to people living with serious illness alongside their other healthcare teams, with the goal of improving people's quality of life. You can access a palliative care team wherever you receive your healthcare anytime after being diagnosed with a serious illness, and the sooner the better. Our first webinar with SUCM was an overview of palliative care for the South Asian community, and we hope you'll check it out on our website or on YouTube to learn more. And I'll just say hello to everybody who's joining us right now. We're starting with some introductions, so welcome. Now I'd like to introduce Mukund Acharya. Mukund is president and co-founder of SUCM. SUCM's mission is to advocate for and promote healthy aging, living well, and preparing for life's transitions among the Bay Area's growing South Asian population. Prior to his current ventures in social entrepreneurship, Mukund was an aerospace engineer, professor, and technologist. And in addition to other community volunteering, we are really fortunate that Mukund also volunteers at Stanford Hospital and School of Medicine as a member of the Cancer Center Design Team, an active part of our Patient and Family Partner Program, and as a spiritual services volunteer. And before I let Mukund introduce our speaker, we wanted to let you know that during this presentation, you can drop in questions anytime in the question and answer box. And we will have some time at the end of the presentation for questions and answers. And with that, I will turn it over to Mukund.
Thank you so much, Claire, for that lovely introduction. And I would also like to join you, Claire, in welcoming everyone to this webinar. And I'm so happy you were able to join us. We feel that there is a real need for our community to be better informed on this topic. So we at SUCM are very pleased to partner with Stanford to bring you today's presentation. If you'd like to learn more about SUCM, please visit our website, sucm.org, or you can contact me directly to chat about it. First, I'd like to begin by introducing our speaker. Ms. Vijaya Parameswaran is a dietitian and diabetes educator at Stanford's South Asian Translational Heart Initiative, or Satie in short. She completed her graduate studies and dietetic internship here in the Bay Area and is a social science researcher with the Division of Cardiology at Stanford School of Medicine. Her area of research includes the use of digital health technologies to enhance lifestyle modification programs. And she's also currently program manager for CardioClick, which is an innovative digital health telemedicine platform that Stanford Healthcare has adopted for video visits during the current COVID-19 pandemic. Vijaya is working on her doctoral thesis right now. And as part of that thesis, she is currently studying the individual and systemic drivers of protein choice and approaches towards crafting a sustainable food system. So we have an expert to talk to us today. Next slide, please, Vijaya. So let me begin by telling you just a little bit about the Satie program. It seeks to understand and improve risk prediction of heart disease in South Asians and to develop targeted diagnostic and therapeutic approaches to detect and prevent heart disease. Satie aims to teach young South Asians in the Bay Area who have developed or have a risk of developing heart disease, and then use novel treatment approaches such as digital health technology, wearables, and so on, with the oversight of a multidisciplinary team in between periodic appointments with their cardiologists. Vijaya, next slide. So as you see here, we have this focus because South Asians are at high risk for what is termed cardiometabolic disease. That's a life-threatening combination of stroke, diabetes, and heart disease. We South Asians make up a quarter of the world's population, but bear greater than 60% of the world's cardiovascular disease burden. They tend to develop these diseases about 10 years earlier than other ethnicities, and the disease tends to be more severe at first presentation, with a greater incidence of higher risk of multivessel disease. And mortality rates are also 40% higher after the first heart attack. As you can see from this slide, data for California show that Asian Indians have higher rates of hospitalization for heart attack and stroke when compared to whites and other Asians such as Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino, actually about 4 times higher. Also, in South Asians, this is not a disease of the elderly. More than half of the first heart attack in Asian Indians occurs before the age of 50, as you can see in the chart on the right side. And the gray bar there shows that 1 in 4 heart attacks in Asian Indians occurred before the age of 40. And although many South Asians do not have the traditional risk factors associated with heart disease, such as smoking and obesity, Satie addresses other underlying risk factors for South Asians, including what's called insulin resistance, as well as hypertension and lipid abnormalities. There's a lot more detail to that, but in order to cover that, we would need a whole separate presentation. Next slide, please, Vijaya. So what I have just described with the previous slide is sufficient, however, to make you aware of this significant risk that South Asians have for atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So you can ask the question, what can you and I do about this? While we cannot control genetic and hereditary factors, we can identify and act on the things that are within our control. For example, exercise, diet, whether you smoke, your weight, how much you sleep, and to some degree, how well you control your stress. These are all risk factors that you and I can control or mitigate. And we can work to the best of our ability to improve each of these. So my message to all of you is that we should take the time to address our health, just as we take the time out for things like educating our children. Especially if you have a family history of heart disease, you should consider a special program such as the Satie Program at Stanford to get an advanced evaluation which offers personalized guidance and counseling following that evaluation. Whether you have a history of heart disease or not, the earlier you make health a priority, the more likely you are to have long-term good health. Studies show that plaque buildup can begin as early as the age of 25. You should start with your primary care physician to establish your own baseline and determine if you have any of the traditional risk factors, such as hypertension or diabetes. The Heart Foundation says that the best way to look after our heart is with a healthy lifestyle that consists of 8 steps: being smoke-free, manage blood cholesterol, manage blood pressure, manage diabetes, be physically active, achieve and maintain a healthy weight, enjoy a variety of nutritious foods, and look after your mental health. By managing your lifestyle and food habits well, you can give yourself the best chance of maintaining good heart health longer. And as an added bonus, recent research has shown that what is good for the heart is equally good for the brain. Experts tell us that a heart-healthy diet, such as the Mediterranean or DASH diet that you all are probably familiar with, these are also the best diets for maintaining cognitive vitality and brain function. In fact, they recommend what is known as the MIND diet, which is the Mediterranean DASH intervention for neurodegenerative delay. So in this talk, Vijaya will focus on one of those 8 important steps: good nutrition for heart health. And she will do so in the context of South Asian habits, food habits, and cultural traditions. We are really fortunate to have an expert like Vijaya speak to us today, as I'm sure you'll all agree with me by the end of this session. Vijaya, over to you.
Thank you, Mukund and Claire. It is an honor to be here. I really appreciate the invitation and your effort to host me. And thank you so much for the work that you do with palliative care for the South Asian community. Thank you. Thank you very much. So our talk today is going to mainly focus on some aspects of nutrition that have become, that have surfaced in popularity recently. And I wanted to address this in the context of the South Asian culture and food habits. My role in terms of how I follow these principles whenever there's new literature is I go to the source, I validate, I vet it. At Stanford, in our clinic, we have a policy where we make sure that the tests and studies that we choose are gold standards. And then in my practice, I go back to basics and think about how South Asian foods and cultures have impacted my life. And then I try and break it down into simple steps. So I'm going to try and do that for you in the context of two topics today: intermittent fasting and digestive health. And we'll try and integrate food and cultural practices around these two topics. And I'm going to hopefully leave you with a few practical tips that you'll be able to start implementing by the end of the session today. So I'm starting this with a case study, and the reason I'm starting it this way is to kind of ground and humanize this for you, so it may be a bit relatable. We're only going to focus on this case study's nutritional and lifestyle behaviors, and only a couple of them in the context of intermittent fasting and digestive health. There are a lot of factors that go into one's cardiometabolic risk profile. As Mukund mentioned, there are a variety of factors. There are your modifiable factors and your non-modifiable factors. There are several clinical outcomes that we look at, incorporating lipid panels, lipid abnormalities, a variety of things. So the case study that I'm going to share with you to humanize this does not include all of that, but really keeps it simple in terms of lifestyle behaviors and food choices. So this is a 48-year-old South Asian immigrant who came to the United States about 25-ish years ago. So very well acculturated to the Western lifestyle and diet. This person weighs about 198 pounds and a BMI of 30.1. As Mukund mentioned earlier in the talk today about weight and obesity, in South Asians, the BMI guidelines, as recommended by the World Health Organization, is tighter. There's a tighter guideline, the threshold is lower. So a BMI of less than 23, and a BMI is basically your weight in relation to your surface area. So the goal, as recommended by the World Health Organization, is to keep your BMI under 23. So this person is much heavier, and by South Asian standards is obese. He gained 10 pounds in the last year and blames it due to, the pandemic-related disruptions. Has recently incorporated walking about walks a mile and started intermittent fasting recently. The intermittent fasting that this person tried to incorporate really is more what we call as time restricted eating. So breakfast was kind of pushed out later, which almost was like a skipped breakfast at about 1 o'clock, and dinner was pushed out closer to 9:30 or 10. And this person decided to do it this way because he has the habit of late night snacking and didn't want to go to bed on an empty stomach, which I think many of us can relate to who have long work days and late evening meetings. And the other thing that struck me, and that I'm going to discuss in the context of digestive health, is this GI sensitivity. Is a sensitivity to things like beans and lentils, which we've grown up eating. And he also presents with general fatigue, especially after eating. Feels like taking a nap, that kind of thing. So here you see a short breakdown of a typical diet, which I usually ask, what did you eat the day before? And this is just a recount. As you'll see, it's meat and rice, chicken and rice for lunch, a salad, again, a chicken, broccoli for dinner, and snacking, some beers, and a couple of granola bars, which he calls our pickup snacks. We'll come back to this case study at the end of our talk, as once I go over these concepts of intermittent fasting and the digestive health for you. And we'll see how he was able to incorporate some changes. So starting with intermittent fasting, what is interesting for me and maybe for all of us here is how the South Asian culture utilizes fasting. So it is, it runs through several generations. And it is not a concept which really is very much focused on time restricted eating as much as religious fasting, right? So we have day fasts where you don't eat anything in the day and you break the fast at night. You have 24-hour fasts. You also have fasts like, Jains do Navratri fast. There is Ramadan. So there are various different ways of fasting. What is fascinating about this fasting principles in our culture is it appears to be more a break from routine. So the foods that are usually consumed during fast appears to also vary regionally, right? So in Maharashtra, for example, which is mainly a wheat-based diet, you would see that fast foods or foods that are eaten, consumed during a fast would not include wheat. And then it would include things like varai, sabudana, things like that. In southern India, on the other hand, which is mainly a rice-based diet, on fast, they would take a break from eating rice and it would be wheat. So it was beautifully ingrained in a break from routine. Um, Also grounded in religious practices. So the whole family almost altered their practice around this fast. There was a law, the support system, if you will, was profound. Everything that was going to be prepared for the fast, all of that preparations would happen ahead of time. So it was really beautiful how they did it then. What we are seeing now, and in the context of intermittent fasting, which I'm going to talk to you about soon, is really focused on what we call as time-restricted eating. So this here is basically a meta-analysis, a study that reviewed 16 trials, looked at the data in terms of what was presented, what are the benefits, if you will, or the metabolic effects of intermittent fasting. The study concluded that most importantly, the biggest benefit across all of these different trials was really the adherence or avoidance of late night eating. So adjusting your eating to the circadian clock, which basically is the sunrise and sunset, right? So adjusting to that and maintaining nightly fasting across all of these studies showed to have the biggest benefits. And the benefits were mostly regulated by how this fasting influenced your gut microbiome, how it influenced your metabolism, and therefore led to a positive effect on obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and cancer, which we call Western diseases. The other study that I want to talk to you about here is a study that compared time-restricted eating versus caloric restriction. What they found in this study, and this was a really small study, but they did a very good job in conducting the study in a really controlled environment. We have to understand that when we talk about nutritional studies, these are not easy to conduct. The way we live, the way we eat, there are so many confounding factors. So if we have to really pressure test this in a lab, if we have to look at this as a dose response, as a medication, it takes a lot. So here in this study, what they did was they only looked at 8 pre-diabetic men, but they really controlled it to make sure that they fed these 2 groups. They were split into 2 groups, a time-restricted feeding group and a caloric-restricted feeding group. Both of them received the same amount of calories and the same type of nutrients. And what they saw was they checked for weight loss, but they also checked for metabolic markers. And what they saw that regardless of weight loss, metabolic markers in the time-restricted eating group really improved. One interesting thing for me in terms of this time-restricted eating group was, which may not be practical for most of us, is that they really restricted the eating to the principles of the circadian clock, where the eating was restricted to about 6 hours. So mainly, that may not be realistic for us. So they started, it was a 6-hour eating window, dinner was by 3 o'clock. But the net summary is that even without weight loss, there was improvement in metabolic markers like insulin resistance. The other study that I'm going to talk about was very recently published, September 2020. Again, a fantastic study that looked at two groups. Those who have a consistent meal time, which I think is more realistic. Even back in Ayurveda, the emphasis on following a schedule is something that I kind of found and related to. So there was a consistent meal time group, and then there was a group that had a time restricted eating. And what they saw, they did this over 12 weeks, and what they saw was that overall, the weight loss was slightly higher in the time-restricted eating group as opposed to the group that was calorie restricted, which was roughly about a kilogram. But what struck me most importantly was this graph where you can see that the dose response, the rate of weight loss varied across individuals. There are individuals who lost as much as 5 kilos, and then there were those who, some even gained some weight, right? But when we're looking at studies like this, and when we are trying to extract the, one sentence takeaway, it is correct that it does, the average weight loss is about a kilogram, but the individualized response is something that we cannot ignore. So what I wanted to, summarize for us here in terms of what these studies are showing is that the biggest benefit of intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating is really aligning it to the circadian clock to avoid late night eating, or to eliminate as much as possible nighttime eating. And if possible, trying to get your eating pattern to the principles that we have followed, back in Ayurveda, back in our culture, where we, finish up dinner by 6 or 7 o'clock or whatever is realistic for you. So some of the practical applications in terms of how you integrate this intermittent fasting into your routine is try to see if you can plan your fast, right? It doesn't have to be every day. It doesn't have to be a restricted eating window like the case that I was talking about. It can be 1 day a week. It can be 1 day a month. You want to plan your fast in a way that it is the most easiest for you to follow. Practice that I have found useful in my own case is I like to fast on days, or I like to do time restrict eating on days where I have back-to-back meetings and I just don't have the time to take a break. May not be practical for you, and I would say that the best way to do it is probably to do it like we did back in our culture, where we take a 24-hour day, find a day of the week where it's most conducive, whether it be a weekday or a weekend. The duration is adjustable. The food choice is adjustable. In Ayurveda, they talk about liquid fasting for those who have kapha prakriti. There are a variety of ways to do this. You just have to figure out what works for you. The net summary is that it can lead to weight loss. It does lead to metabolic improvement. The one thing you want to be careful about is avoiding late night eating, and also avoiding processed sugar, processed foods, and added sugars while you're going through this process. Because in my personal experience, I call added sugars, caffeine, these type of things as mind-altering substances. And when you are trying to restrict your eating, when you're trying to be in that Zen state of fasting, as much as possible, you want to avoid these stimulants. The second topic of our talk today is on digestive health. So what is fascinating about digestive health, and again, I'm bringing this in the context of that case that we talked about, where the ability to digest high fiber foods appears to have diminished. So it always blows my mind when I think about how integrated our microbiome is with our human biology. A fun fact is that we have 100 times more microbial genes than the human genome, which means that from a genetic perspective, we are 99% bacteria and just 1% human. I found that to be, very interesting. And these microbes are so integrated to our system is that they almost are like an organ, if you will, and they significantly impact our metabolism. And as you will see in the next couple of slides, that they actually can dictate a variety of metabolic activity and immune functions, like weight loss. one of the things that I want to kind of bring home with this model is Dr. Erika Sonnenberg at Stanford has done a fantastic work, continues to do great work on the gut microbiome and gut diversity. And this is a figure that she uses to kind of describe how our diet has evolved over the years. So we started off as hunter-gatherers, and over the course of several thousands years, we have now in this Western diet, which is highly processed, a highly sanitized diet. And what this has done to our gut diversity is our ability to digest these complex carbohydrates have started to diminish. And what I think is fascinating, which I will show you in my upcoming slide, is that the foods that we have chosen with our Western diet, which are highly processed, high in fat, high in sugars, significantly alter the way we digest these foods and affect the way our body responds, our insulin regulates. So this figure here, I'd like for you to look at the top section and then the bottom section. So here, let's start with the broccoli, and then we'll go to the piece of cake. So majority of the microbes in our body live in the colon, and that's where they basically doing all the wonderful work that they are supposed to be doing. So when we eat something that is a high fiber content, like say a vegetable or a complex grain like red rice, quinoa, anything like that, something that has a good amount of fiber, the fiber component of this is largely undigested until it reaches the colon, because our body doesn't have the ability to break down fiber. This fiber, this breakdown of our food is basically digested by our bacteria. It's basically their food, right? And as the bacteria breaks down these fibers, they release metabolites, and these metabolites enter our circulation, and that is how they mitigate and help improve our metabolism, improve things like insulin sensitivity. All of those good things that are happening are because of those metabolites that are secreted into our system from the microbes. On the other hand, here, if you look at this piece of cake, this again is more representative of the Western diet, which is high in processed refined grains, sugars. These actually do not get, even much before they get to our colon, they are broken down, and when they enter our circulation, they enter our circulation much sooner, and they really increase the risk of insulin resistance, metabolic dysfunction, and increased inflammation. So I want to share the study that Dr. Sonnenberg, Dr. Gardner did in their lab recently, and they call this the Phi-5-4 study. And I'm going to just share the main key findings from it, which I find fascinating. So they basically looked at the effects of high fiber foods and fermented foods on the gut microbial diversity and on other metabolites. And what they saw was that high fiber foods, so this was basically mainly looking at high fiber foods. Patients were instructed to consume high fiber foods. They were told what high fiber foods were, and they had a choice of choosing whichever fiber they wanted. Similarly, with fermented foods, they were pointed to sources like kombucha, yogurt, kefir, and then the patients had the choice of choosing whichever fermented food or probiotic food they wanted. And what they saw was the nutrient profile of the microbial diversity improved in both the high fiber food group as well as the fermented group. So check mark, you significantly can influence your gut microbial diversity with diet. great news. The second thing is that the inflammation response was different in the sense that the fermented group did see a decrease in inflammation, but the high fiber foods did see an individualized response in inflammation. And how Dr. Sonnenberg describes this in her research is that those individuals who seem to have a higher inflammation rate in the high fiber foods were probably the ones who started off with a much lower microbial diversity. So in a nutshell, what this tells us is that we can certainly, even if you're starting off with a microbial diversity which is poor, we can significantly influence it by incorporating high fiber foods, by incorporating fermented foods, and diet can certainly be a lever to improve our microbiome and our health. So let's go back to some of the South Asian foods that we may be familiar with or may not be familiar with or have forgotten. And I just due to the inability to cram or to put everything in the slides, I've just taken a few pearls, which are my favorite pulses and lentils to kind of share with you. I bring up horse gram here because this is a pulse I think some of you may be familiar with in southern India. Which is, power packed with nutrients. Many of these, pulses and plant-based proteins, if you will, do have anti-nutrients or phytates, if you will, that these plants basically have to protect them from the environment. And the human gut, as I've shown you in the previous figure, does not have the ability to extract nutrients from these phytates because these phytates act as anti-nutrients. And so in Ayurveda, if you may know, there are several cooking practices that have been prescribed to make it easy for us to digest these foods. For example, roasting, your pulse or your lentil or bean before cooking significantly breaks down phytates, and that improves the bioavailability, if you will, of nutrients once you cook them after roasting. So if that's something that is practical for you, I highly recommend it. If it is not possible for you to roast your beans every time before you cook, when you buy them in bulk on a weekend, if you decide to roast them, that's another nice way to do it. You could also put it in your oven at a low temperature, but I find it to be highly valuable. I've listed garbanzo and kidney beans, which of course, we may be much more familiar with, also because they are more, easily available. Most of, regional variations within India incorporate garbanzo and kidney beans. So again, simple principle of soaking, and then if you have an Instapot, you're cooking them in your pressure cooker. Works really well. It was interesting for me earlier on as I entered this field of nutrition. I was asked by a patient whether protein content of lentils and beans is it different? Do beans have more proteins than lentils? And what is interesting is that the nutrient profile is very similar between both lentils and beans. And so for those of us who may have challenges with digesting beans, for example, if it makes you very gassy or bloated, roasting is one way to do it, but also going back to the simple principles as outlined in Ayurveda is to start off with something like moong dal, which is easier to digest. There's no compromise that is made in terms of the protein content, and it's also a great source of dietary fiber, and will help you with improving your microbial diversity. So if you find yourself not being able to digest these foods, I would urge you to start adding them in small amounts, following some of these cooking principles that I talked about. In terms of the grains, my emphasis on whole intact grains here and to look beyond wheat and rice is only to kind of shine the light, if you will, on the variety of grains that we have, and variations within our regions in India. So amaranth, for example, ragi is used in Western India as a food that is consumed during fast. Is a very good source of iron. Popped amaranth has become extremely popular. You can order it online these days. Millet, again, variety of millets. We don't have to rely on one. We have several that are available in the Bay Area. Barley, sorghum. Sorghum is a little tricky, jowar, if you will, in that it's a very good source of fiber, but it's one of the hardest to cook. And so especially for jowar, I would urge you that if you are including jowar, then it is best to roast it before. I also know that in Western India, when they make it's a Marathi dish called thali peet, where they use jowar and bajra and a variety of these grains. They're all usually pre-roasted and then powdered. I also think that grains like varai and sabudana, which are not something that we would use regularly, are also have a great fantastic nutrient profile. The reason I'm bringing up all of these grains is, again, to highlight the importance of consuming complex carbohydrates, as highlighted in Dr. Sonnenberg's study, and the value that these bring us in terms of improving our gut microbiome. I want to talk about a couple of, about vegetables. And I see that we've emphasized a lot on non-starchy vegetables, which I'll talk about shortly. But because of this, the focus on starchy vegetables has kind of diminished. At least that's what I see in clinic. There's a fear for carbohydrates, and there's a fear for eating anything that is, that could be a rich source of carbohydrates. And I think that it is important to kind of start utilizing some of the nutritional benefits that tubers provide. So it's important to kind of look beyond the potato, if you will, and start looking at things like yuca, turnip, taro, kohlrabi. These are all vegetables that have very simple preparations in the South Asian cuisine, with just a little tadka, oil tempered with mustard seeds and green chilies, and they taste great. They also cook very quickly in the Instapot, and you can easily add these with your lentils while you're cooking, and you're significantly improving the nutrient profile of your dish. Squashes too are an example of starchy vegetables. So what I talked about in terms of the tubers are starchy vegetables. Squash is also considered a starchy vegetable, but these are all excellent sources of dietary fiber. So you want to see if you can incorporate this, especially when they are in season. I particularly like dudi, which is so versatile, has very simple flavor that can easily be blended as an added to whichever flavor profile you want. Talking about non-starchy vegetables, if you've seen me in clinic, I talk about this all the time. These again are so many choices that we have in our South Asian cuisine. So I would urge you to look beyond the cauliflower and the cabbage. Not that they're excellent, but these are all ways for you to really incorporate some simple variations in flavor and texture and make your meal interesting. Okra, for example, here is a fantastic source of soluble fiber, great for regulating blood sugars. I've put mustard greens in there. And I was compiling this list, and I was thinking about so many different mustard greens that I've been exposed to in India. So here you have the amaranth greens on the right. They call it lal mat. There is a completely red amaranth. There is green amaranth. We have varieties of chards. So thinking beyond the spinach and the kale is what I'm urging you, not because they are because they all deserve attention, because they are all great and they are nutritious and easy to prepare and easy to integrate and make your meal interesting. Let's talk about fermentation. So fermentation, again, is an age-old South Asian tradition. And one of the benefits amongst the several in terms of fermentation, it was really mainly a preservation technique, which improved shelf life. One of the fascinating things about fermentation is that it really doesn't take much to ferment. One of the key ingredients of fermentation is temperature, as you would know. So I think that if you don't have the ability to ferment foods at home, there are plenty of resources available online that can show you how to pickle vegetables, for example, where the only ingredients are salt, water, and sunlight or temperature. you could buy store-bought fermented foods too. Cooking does not degrade the probiotic quality of the meal. At least it's not been shown to. So I would urge you to start thinking about ways that you could incorporate, fermented food. So dahi or yogurt is the first thing that comes to my mind. There are a variety of beverages, obviously, with that are dahi inspired. I don't know if any of you have heard about kanji, at least from those from the northern India would have. It's a carrot drink where they ferment carrots, they keep it, in sunlight, and it's done over 4 or 5 days, and then the carrot breaks down. And so there are multiple ways that our culture incorporates these. And if these are not conducive to your lifestyle, as in like if you're not able to make them, I would say, a bottle of kombucha from your grocery store, it works perfectly fine. I really like the traditional ways also of making dokla, handvo, idli. And the reason I emphasize the traditional means is because there was no shortcut, right? We didn't add a teaspoon of or fruit salt to kind of speed up for the baking soda to act and give you that nice soft texture. We allowed time and bacteria to do their magic. So I think that if you kind of make this important in your lifestyle, there are ways to do it. And I'll talk about a couple of gadgets that can help you do this as well. I also think it's fascinating in terms of how versatile we were in terms of incorporating fermented foods. For example, raita, or in Maharashtra, they call it koshambir. In southern India, they call it pachadi, which was really a combination of raw vegetables and yogurt with a little bit of tempering. So there are a variety of ways. And amla, I mean, I cannot, we would probably need a whole session if I have to talk about gooseberry or amla for its amazing nutrient properties. And pickled amla or fermented amla is great for digestion, great to eat with whatever other meal that you're consuming. So the net summary behind my sharing intermittent fasting and digestive health and talking about South Asian food choices is for you to for me to try to steer you away from an all or nothing approach, and to be mindful, go back to basics and start thinking about how can you integrate these into your daily life. And it's not easy. This graph here is basically shows you how weight loss is really difficult to maintain. We are hardwired to maintain our weight. So any effort that we put towards weight loss, you do have your metabolism acting on the other way to try to get you back to where you were. So it's not easy. We're also in a food environment where we're surrounded by processed foods. We are surrounded by treats. We also, food delivery has made it so easy to eat whatever you want. There's drive-throughs. There is, whichever app you choose to have your food delivered, however late in the night, it is given to you. So the food environment is a huge culprit, but I don't think it is fair for us to blame it all on the food environment. I think you have to recognize that there are ways that you can influence the food environment, and I'll share a couple of examples. But I want us to underscore that this is not easy. There are a variety of forces that are working against your willpower, if you will, here. So you have to be deliberate. And therefore, an all or nothing approach doesn't work, because you want to try to find an approach that you can sustain, that you can iterate, that enables you to think about how you feel, so you can take it back and iterate it, and take it back to a place where you're able to repeat it in a way that you're able to influence your life and also those around you. So how do you influence your food environment? I talked about a few examples before. I think having access is really, really critical. Having access to things like dahi at home, easy way. If you have it in the fridge, you're likely to consume it. Similarly with chas and lassi, if you have access to dahi, later in the afternoon, if you want a pickup snack, you can easily, with dahi, dilute it, add a little bit of hing and green chilies, and you're ready to go. So there are a variety of ways that you could make this interesting for you, but the first thing is for you to have it in your pantry. So your pantry really is one of the important factors in your food environment. Having access to batters, right? Whether you make it at home or whether you buy it at store, it doesn't matter. The first thing is for you to get started. So making sure that you have access to an adai batter or a dosa batter or a pesarattu batter just makes it easier for you in the morning on a given day. If you don't have a good amount of time to make lunch, you have some leftover vegetables, you could make a pancake, lentil, dosa, whatever you want to call it, and you're already incorporating fermented foods, high in fiber, and very nutritious and tasty. Fermented chutneys, I came across this recipe online, and I started incorporating some of these simple recipes where you can, do fruit chutneys, for example. You can do vegetable chutneys, very easy to make, and taking advantage of time or temperature as an ingredient really helps. You don't want to speed track this, but there are a variety of ways to do this. I think planning ahead, making this a priority, really is critical, and having a conversation with your significant other, with your family, in terms of how this is going to play out. That's what is really critical, because having an approach like this where you know that you're going to try a few things and it may or may not work is important. Some of the gadgets that I find very valuable, first of all, I really like the Instapot. I also like the yogurt setting in the Instapot, because temperature, like I said, is a key ingredient when you're fermenting foods, and the Instapot has a yogurt setting. If your Instapot doesn't have a yogurt setting, you can choose the lowest temperature, and that just works fine. If you don't have an Instapot, you can heat some milk up, put it in your oven with the light on a closed, cold oven with the light on. It takes it about 80 degrees. That works too. If none of those work for you, you don't have the time, grabbing a box of yogurt from the grocery store works just fine. I like the Instapot. I also like the air fryer. And I think the air fryer has really changed the game of roasting vegetables. In a quick 20-minute, 30-minute window. And I really like the mandolin. The mandolin is basically just a slicer, and the combination of a mandolin slicer and the air fryer is really a happy place. So you could really start slicing tubers, like for example, yucca can be sliced thin on your mandolin, and you can air fry it, and you have yucca chips. So these are really simple things to do, not difficult by any means, but you just need to plan and incorporate and set yourself up for success. You want to have a pantry, you want to have a food environment that enables you to practice some of these tricks. The other thing that I said here that may or may not be practical for many of you is the stone grinder. The stone grinder is probably something that you would see in most South Indian households who rely on, idli and dosa on a regular basis. And the stone grinder, I find it fascinating because it as it grinds, it basically remains open. It incorporates air. It ferments faster. And the texture of the dosa or the adai or whatever you cook, at least for me, I find it to be superior. This is an example of a tabletop stone grinder. Now, if it is logical for you, this would be a good investment. If not, I would just buy it from the store. Just make sure that you have access to it. In terms of shopping practices, again, this has to be prioritized. Some people like to have a weekly menu, and I'd love to hear from all of you if any, if you prepare a menu, if you've been interested in a menu, how do you think about your food? These are all, great things that we can, brainstorm once the presentation is over in our Q&A session. But I find it highly valuable to actually have a menu. That way you kind of have a sense of what your week is going to look like. That way you have a sense of what foods you need, what you have, how do you, what type of food choices that you're going to make in a certain week. It'll also force you to think about what are your treats. So you want to separate your snack from a treat, and you want to have those treats as something that is a treat, not a snack. So for example, if you're at the Indian store and if you've grabbed a box of laddu, first of all, it's a festival food. It is a treat. It cannot be a snack. So simple things like that. Taking it back to the simple principle of the plate method, the USDA came up with the plate method several years ago. It used to be in the form of the food guide pyramid. The plate method, I think, is a lot easier because if you don't want to count calories, which you don't have to, there are several ways to just create a caloric deficit and still reach that weight loss that you're looking for. The plate method I find to be very valuable because it's a simple template. A 9-inch plate that 50% vegetables, quarter of it is a protein, quarter of it is a grain, is a simple way to make sure that you're getting a balanced diet. Taking it back to, I'll try to wrap it up in a minute so I have enough time for your questions. Going back to our case, what this person did was when I saw him back in clinic in about 3 months, he had lost 8 pounds. Most importantly, he was feeling great. He recognized that he had a long way to go. He had actually changed his intermittent fasting pattern because he was really craving that late evening snack. He was also addicted, in his words, to this mocha and croissant that he was having in the morning, which he felt like he needed to eat at 1 o'clock, and then he was starting his meal at 1:30. So many of these patterns slowly started to shift after our conversation, and he's taking it slow, but surely he's still incorporating intermittent fasting, but he's doing it on 2 days a week, which are most logical for him. Those are the days where he doesn't have late evening calls. He's able to wrap up his dinner closer to 7 or 8. He's able to get a walk done. So slow changes, but deliberate changes. He's making an effort to include small amounts of lentils, and he's adding tofu. That way his reliance on meat-based proteins are slowly shifting a little bit. So he's getting some, diversity in terms of his protein choices. And so obviously it's not all fixed. This is not a silver bullet. He has ways to go. I'm not discussing his metabolic profile, which did improve, but again, there are ways to go. So it's important to think about simple things that can be done starting today and putting one step in front of the other, and doing your best and making sure that you have a healthcare team that empowers you to make these decisions. What I'm not able to cover today, and the reason I put them down in the list is because if you have questions around these topics, we'll try to address it. I'm sure Claire would be happy to host this again. There are a variety of things that I'm asked about, in terms of a nutrition prescription. For example, how many carbohydrates, how much protein, how much fat. We are not able to talk about that today. We're not able to talk about the regional variations. I was not able to cover some of the fantastic things that people in West Bengal eat, people in Northern India eat. We didn't talk about gluten or lactose considerations, which are really important. We also didn't talk about the beautiful seasonal eating principles that we have from Ayurveda, which works really well and kind of fits in really really well with this ability to have fermented foods. We were not able to talk about celebratory foods and snacks, but I'm really happy to share this information with you, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
So, thank you so much. Yeah, there's Claire. Claire's back.
I am back. Yes, thank you so much. We'll jump right in with questions. So the first one is, how good is it to be vegan with getting no probiotic?
So that's a two-part question. How good is it to be a vegan? How good is it to get no probiotics? I think there's an assumption that is being made here that dairy is the only source of probiotic. Your complex carbohydrates, and so in terms of vegetables, lentils, beans, all of these, remember, are digested by the bacteria. And so these are your prebiotics that can then get converted to probiotics. So a vegan diet, I think, is, it's fantastic. What I usually see in clinic is the need for supplementation with B12, but it doesn't have to be devoid from probiotics, if you will. And another thing that comes to my mind as I'm answering this question for you is to also use things like kombucha, kimchi. These are, other things that are beyond our South Asian tradition. But again, pickled vegetables are a great way to incorporate, the happy bacteria. Good job for, that's a good question. Thank you.
Great. And do probiotics in food survive stomach acid?
They do. Yeah, they do. They do. I'm not an expert in this topic, and I hold on to Dr. Sonnenberg and her research. But what we see, and she studied, the Hamza tribe in Africa, and there's plenty of good literature that she has published, which shows how their gut continues to remain, and is now, of course, changing, but continues to remain in terms of how their food choices are seasonal, and the diversity, the different species that she sees in their gut versus ours is fascinating. So they do survive stomach acid.
Great. And would you be concerned about lectins in beans and whole grains?
So lectins are anti-nutrients, and I think that a lot of this inability to digest lentils and beans are probably surfacing these anti-nutrients a lot more. Again, for a question like this, I would just go back to my basics and think about, so if lectins are a problem, how would I deal with it? I would try to follow the dry roasting. I would try to sprout. That's something that we didn't talk about today. Sprouting is another great way to improve bioavailability of foods. So my concern with avoiding lectin is significantly because the fiber content and the fermented nature of some of these vegetables and grains are then completely eliminated if you have to follow a diet that doesn't include lentils and beans.
Thank you. And can we roast the lentils in the oven?
Yeah, you just have to be, you have to play with it a little bit. Start with a small batch. I usually roast them at the lowest temperature possible, so it depends on your oven setting. But yeah, you can roast them. And I'd love to know how it turned out.
And is it myth or true that millets need to be soaked before eating?
I would not put a blanket recommendation on whether they be soaked or not, but I think it's a very good idea to soak if you have the time. Most of these questions, in terms of, when this thought occurs to you, you do want to think about what is the most feasible and practical for you. What are the ways that you can start making changes, but you can sustain them, right? The last thing, and of course, this happens to all of us all the time, which is we're really hyped up about doing something. So next week, it's going to be dosa on the menu and yogurt on the menu. And then 2 weeks down the line, you're back to eating what you were, which is fine. But, you want to kind of think about these things in that context. If it is soaking is definitely valuable, definitely improves nutrient profile and biodiversity. Fantastic if you're soaking it the night before. So yeah, that's how I would take it. I don't have a clear yes or no answer for that though.
Okay, and is there a lot of protein in eggplants?
All vegetables, believe it or not, have protein. So definitely, I don't quite know exactly how much, whether and to what, whether they have a lot or not. But it is, take my word for it, there's plenty of literature there as well on it, that plants have a lot, a variety of nutrients, along with they're a good source of protein.
Great, thank you. We're doing these rapid fire because I wanted to get through so many. I think we maybe can do 2 more questions, and then looks like we have quite a few questions. So one thing, Sukuman, we might consider doing is having another event where we could have more time for questions and answers, or maybe like a Facebook Live. So for those of you who don't get your questions answered, maybe we could do something like that. Okay, so I hope I say this right. Kadi, is that considered a fermentation product? KADHI, or maybe
Curry? Yeah, curry. Yes, so curry is basically it's a yogurt dish. I think, we are getting closer and closer to dinner. So all of us are going to be really hungry after the session today. Curry, yes. So curry is basically made with yogurt. Yes, it's a fermented food. I would also urge you to try air fried pakoras, which are, which have no oil, but that vegetable like cabbage and bell pepper and a little bit of chickpea flour, and they go great with that curry.
Okay, I think this might be our last one. Can you comment on lectins in nuts? And can you use almonds with the skin in a protein shake?
Yes. So, at least in Ayurveda, nuts are best eaten soaked and soaked and peeled. So, for example, one of the reasons why almonds are recommended to be soaked overnight and peeled is, again, to make sure that the anti-nutrients, phytates, lectins are basically broken down and your body is able to derive nutrients from it. The enzymes that are naturally there in almonds are basically more bioactive and better for us to absorb. So if it is practical for you to soak nuts before you eat, sure, I think that's fine. But I think that if you're not able to, you also want to think about your digestive health. Has it deteriorated? And think about what are some simple things that you can get started. So if it is logical for you in your lifestyle to include soaked nuts, then sure. If not, if you're eating them, roasted out of a box, surely, the recommendation from for a heart healthy diet is about an ounce of nuts a day. I think that inability to digest lentils and beans is what worries me more. And starting there with soaking and roasting and things, and to improve your ability to digest these things, is probably a lower hanging fruit.
Great, Vijaya. Just want to thank you so much for this talk. You had some comments thanking you, saying it was a great seminar, lots more questions. So I did, go ahead, Mukund.
So if anyone has further questions, what we can offer is if they go to the Sukham website and put their questions into the contact me box, I will get those questions. We will get Vijaya to answer them, and then we can post those answers as a follow-up to the talk with the other materials that you might post on the talk. So that offers open to anybody who wants to ask more questions.
Great, thank you. And yes, we'll be sharing the recorded presentation with all of you via email who attended today, and then it will be up on our Stanford YouTube channel, so you can watch it anytime on YouTube too. And then we'll just send out a brief survey afterwards in an email. We'd love if you could give us some comments on how the presentation went for you today. And any other closing remarks from Mukund or Vijaya?
I just wanted to, thank you again. It was fantastic. The more events we have like this, the more we are able to talk to our South Asian community, the more we feel connected. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'm really grateful for the work you and Mukund do, Claire, for palliative care and for the community. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Vijaya, for the presentation. And if you have any other further comments to make, please do respond to the questionnaire the survey that Claire sends out. Put that information there, put your requests in there. We'll get them back and we will respond to them. So thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye-bye.